I had a conversation with a friend of mine about the spiritual nature of our children. And we were talking about what that meant and whether our children are in fact spiritual. And we were talking about how some children have imaginary friends who in fact might be angels. You never know. And the friend I was speaking to was my good friend Susanna. And she has a son who had an imaginary friend. So Susanna, would you like to tell us about Ben?
Sure. So Ben, back when he was young, he had 3 imaginary friends, and they were very, very real to him, as real to him as his father and I were. He would talk to them. He would play with them. Sometimes we would go to the bus stop. We'd walk to the bus stop and we'd pick his friends up, and then we'd walk home with them, and then they would play with him for the day, and usually of a morning and afternoon, often sometimes too, for afternoon tea, morning tea, and lunch as well. I would have to divide his morning tea or his lunch up between 4 plates. So 1 each for his 3 friends and 1 for himself. He had full-on conversations with them. And I guess when he was young, it was all quite acceptable. But as he started to get a bit older, some of my friends would say, oh, like, this isn't healthy. But unfortunately, I didn't understand the spiritual realm back then as much as what I do now. But I knew that the Lord was telling me, no, encourage it, don't discourage it, encourage it. And so I did encourage it. But as he got older, I started to realize that they were more than just imaginary friends for him. And even as a teenager, and to be honest, I think it was about the day before he was married, we were living on acreage, and here he is out in the paddock talking, and he had his back to us. You would swear that he was talking to somebody because he would have all the hand movements, everything. But no, he was actually talking to his 3 friends. And really what I started to realize was that actually they weren't imaginary friends. They were actual angels that were there with him, and he was learning to communicate with the spiritual realm.
So would you say that his imagination and his spirituality, his spirit, were actually linked?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They're very much connected.
I love the way you actually encouraged his imagination and validated what he saw, because I think that's really important for children to know that that is actually a way that they connect with their Heavenly Father, with their Creator, who actually gave them this imagination. So our imagination seems to have an image center. Yeah? So if you imagine a cow, for example, and close your eyes, you see a cow. So that's where you're seeing it, on your image center in your brain, in your imagination. And God uses our imagination to talk to us.
Absolutely.
To show us things, to communicate with us, to draw us closer to himself, to reveal more of his nature to us. So Susanna, would you say it's an important habit to get into as adults, and to also help our children keep our image centers clean?
Yes, no, absolutely. I believe actually your imagination is like a window to your spirit and a window to the spiritual realm. With my son Ben, that his imagination could easily be clouded with things that would hinder him being able to see these 3 imaginary friends, these 3 angels that were with him. Because as a child, I had to be very careful of what he watched on TV. Funnily enough, even Sesame Street, because the Cookie Monster would freak him out like nobody's business. Things that wouldn't worry another child really worried him and frightened him. And so I believe that if we're not careful about what's going in into our imagination as adults and as children, let's face it, we all know that once you have a vision of something and it's in your mind, that's actually your imagination, but it can be very hard to get rid of. And so if we're not deliberate in making sure what goes into our mind, what goes into our imagination, if we're not real deliberate about keeping that clean, keeping that healthy, then we're not going to be able to see in the spiritual realm. We're not going to be able to hear from God or see from God anything like we could if we keep that space available for Him.
I remember when I was a young mother, and my son was he was probably about 11 or 12 already, so he was a bit older. There was a movie everybody was watching, really popular at the time, and a friend of mine came with her son to pick my son up to go to the movies, and she actually said to me, "This is the movie we're going to see." And I'd read about it, and I just knew that it was a movie that would affect him. And so I actually said, "Look, he can't actually go with you because I know this is going to affect him. It's going to affect his emotions, it's going to affect his state of mind, and it's going to affect his imagination." And so I didn't let him go, and I wasn't really popular at all. She actually thought I was crazy not to let him go.
Yeah.
So sometimes we have to actually do things to be intentional about protecting our children's imaginations and their image centers.
And our own.
Yes.
I think it's really very important. I think the imagination has been very misunderstood by Christians. I use my imagination myself to connect in with God, but I do it deliberately now.
Yes.
But what I've realised about myself is, as an adult, that because the imagination was so devalued in Christian circles while I was growing up, and also therefore I devalued it, then I haven't used it for the majority of my life, and so it's got weaker.
Exactly. Our imagination is like a muscle.
Yeah, it is.
The more we use it, the stronger it gets.
Yes, and that's why it's so important for us as parents and myself as a grandparent to be stirring that up within my grandchildren. I'm glad the Lord taught me to stir it up in my son. If I hadn't known what I knew now, I would have stirred it up even more. Because if we don't, it gets stirred up anyhow.
Yes, exactly.
And
it does.
it'll get stirred up by what they're watching on TV. And we're either going to help them as parents and grandparents stir that imagination up to be connecting with Jesus. That's going to be the sort of thing that their imagination will go to, instead of the things that they're seeing on TV or the things that they're reading in books and magazines and things, because their imagination will be used one way or another.
Yes, and not only magazines and TV, but on the internet.
Oh, absolutely.
Everything that isn't good is so easily accessible. But now, the one thing that is fantastic is that when our imagination or our image centers are corrupted, are drawn on, if you like, by the enemy, and become cluttered with all sorts of images that we don't want there is hope.
There is.
Because Jesus can come in and we can ask Him to clean our imagination.
Yes. Yeah.
And we can use our imagination to invite Him in to clean our imaginations.
Yeah.
I think this was a really good discussion. So next week, let's explore this some more, and we'll talk a bit about how we actually clean our imaginations and how we fill those clean imaginations with the things of God. See you next time.